Welcome everyone to the 11th meeting of the Spatial Productivity Lab. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here. December meeting is quite special for us. It is traditionally devoted to our host region of the autonomous provinces of Trentino and Alto-Adige or South Tyrol. This year, this last meeting is also special in a different respect, because we are wrapping up very, let me say, different year in our lives. And actually, for the first time in our history of December SPL meetings, we have quite a few presentations that are based on very recent data coming from this year. In the past, so far, we had 3 December meetings of the Spatial Productivity Lab. And all the interventions, except for the one from the Bank of Italy, were based on the analysis of data coming from a few years back. So for the first time, pandemics allowed us to, have data which is very recent, and we are happy to offer our analysis that are more, that are closer to today, actually. So before we go into the meeting and into introduction by our head of the center, I would like to say a few words about the Spatial Productivity Lab. For those of you who is not familiar with us, we are a relatively small unit, which is research oriented and is hosted by the OECD Trento Centre for Local Development. The team includes economists and policy analysts here in Trento and in Paris, and we have a network of partners. Altogether, we work to identify local sources of productivity growth, and we are trying to find ways how this knowledge can inform policies that would help regions to grow and increase their productivity. So the second angle of our work is to try and help regions to close the inequalities or gaps in their economic development. So without further ado, I would like to invite the head of the OECD Trento Centre for Local Development, Alessandra Proto, to offer her welcome remarks. Alessandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alexandra. And good afternoon to everybody, to the speakers of today's webinar, to the partners of the Spatial Productivity Lab, and all the participants who are following us. The virtual dimension is a bit difficult because we pretend to be a network of friends more than of partners, and not seeing your faces is a bit difficult for me at least to interact. But yeah, I really thank you very much for participating to this last meeting of the year. So I'm very happy. I share Alexandra's indeed happiness today to introduce this special session of the Spatial Productivity Lab meeting dedicated to the region which hosts the OECD Trento Centre for Local Development, namely the Italian region of Trentino, Alto-Adige, South Tyrol. Being the last meeting of 2020, usually the end of the year is the time for making balances and good propositions for the new year. And well, let me say that making balances this year is definitely a tough exercise. But the good part of that is that, as Alexandra already said, the pandemic supported us by providing very recent data, so our balances are at least timely. Well, a few days ago, the OECD has presented its economic outlook 2020. Well, what we know for sure is that the high degree of uncertainty will persist in the coming months. The outlook shows how the crisis has worsened inequality, hitting the most vulnerable in society the hardest. High levels of unemployment, in particular among the low-skilled and young, risk persisting for years. And I should say that unfortunately, many children, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds, have fallen badly behind in their education during lockdowns. Many of us, our families have experienced this, further limiting the opportunities of the children in the future. So for millions of small and medium-sized businesses, the main drivers of job creation, mounting debts and continued uncertainty are putting their survival in jeopardy. The outlook says also that declines in firms' profits will hit their ability to service debts in the future and undermine their capacity to invest. And we know how and what this will mean, of course, for the economy. Young and small as well, less productive companies are expected to be badly affected. In addition to those in the accommodation and food, transport and arts and entertainment sector that are severely affected by the lockdown measures. Trentino, for instance, and Alto-Adige are both very touristic areas, and these days on the news you will just read about complaints and problems that the sector of the touristic sector is facing because of the persistent lockdown during the winter, the so-called winter season. But what we also know is that the economic damage would have been even worse without the massive government financial support now in place to help people and companies in front of the shock. The main OECD recommendation is therefore that policy action should become better targeted to where is needed most and to strengthen the recovery. So from the macro picture of the global outlook, global economic outlook, with the help of our distinguished speakers this afternoon, we will zoom into the specific dimension of the two autonomous provinces of Trento and Bolzano and its recent socio-economic development. So after this very short introduction about the global picture where the region falls in, I would give the floor back to my colleague, Alexandra Tsvetkova, who will provide an overview of the webinar structure and introduce the next speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alessandra. That was very good introduction for our meeting today. As Alessandra said, we are going to really zoom into two provinces. And we have a wonderful lineup of speakers which come from the Spatial Productivity Lab, but most importantly, we have quite a few our partners who continue to contribute to our work and to our meetings, and we are very grateful for their help. So we will start with a quite general view at the situation. We'll look at the disease, at human behavior and employment. The first presentation will be setting the background for the whole webinar, and it will be presented by Wessel Vermeulen, who is a junior economist at the OECD Trento Centre for Local Development. He is a part of the Spatial Productivity Lab, and he just recently joined us, and I'm very happy to have him here. We will go next into a traditional overview of the business cycle, presented by Antonia Accetura, who is the head of the research unit at the Trento branch of the Bank of Italy. And Antonio is like absolute veteran of our December SPL meetings. It is his third participation in our third meeting. So he's been with us for every single one of them. Thank you so much, Antonio. I really appreciate it. I will present some analysis of the job postings or labor demand based on the online announcements. And my name is Alexandra Tsvetkova. I am the economist and policy analyst at the OECD Trento Centre for Local Development. From this more economic kind of view, we'll be moving into a social dimension, and we'll be looking more into cooperatives. In both provinces. We know that here cooperative movement is quite special, and Chiara Carini, who is a researcher at ORIXE, which is the European Research Institute, Institute on Cooperatives and Social Economy, will offer some takeaways from her recent work on the area. Last but not least, we will be very pleased to listen to concluding remarks by Andrea Fracasso, who is also our long-standing partner and participant to our very many SPL meetings. Andrea is a professor of economic policy and director of School of International Studies at the University of Trento. So I think that's the brief overview, and we are ready for our first intervention by Vessel. Vessel, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes, and I encourage all our speakers to stay within our time limits, and I encourage our participants to pose questions so we can get to it during the Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexandra. So what I would like to do is to give an overview of what happened over the past year in the two provinces. Can I see the next slide, please? And you know, everyone has been looking at lots of data. I'm sure what happens a lot is that people are looking at the economic data, of course, but what I would like to do is to first take a step back and to take a more comprehensive view. And with that, I mean to look specifically also at the data of the spread of the disease in the two provinces here specifically, and the policy measures that have been taking place. So to look at the three aspects together, as well as the interaction of the two. What I think is important as well is to look at the local perspective. So we have seen a lot of country level analysis, of course, because it is often easier to do the analysis on the data is available. But I think specifically the interaction between the spread of the disease and the economy, and as well the policy measures that are taking place, they happen at the local level, not at the national level. So I think we can learn a lot by digging into more regional analysis. And then the last aspect I think is important is to use high frequency and up-to-date data, specifically in this very volatile period. It is a shame if we have to work with data that is months old or even a year old, if we are in this situation where we need to take policy measures in a very current and up-to-date situation. So I was also very much interested to see what kind of real-time, very up-to-date data might be available for the two provinces that is publicly available that everyone can do their analysis with. So that's what I'm trying to present in this presentation. So on the next slide, you will see a little bit of context. So in the US, this kind of idea that you can do very local real-time analysis is quite well developed, perhaps most developed in the world. There's a big project that is going on at the moment. In the EU, it's a bit more spotty. There is some analysis done for individual countries at the local level, maybe a small selection of countries, but it is not as comprehensive. So what I'm going to try to do here is to do it for Bolzano and Trento. And I can show what is the potential of it, but also some of the difficulties of doing it, perhaps on a wider scope for either the whole of Italy or for multiple regions and countries in Europe. So what I'm looking specifically at is, so we have the COVID case counts. Everyone has been looking at those over the last year in the newspaper, so I'll use those. We'll have a measure of behavior that is from Google Mobility Report. It's drawn from the locality data that comes from mobile phones. We have some data on the labor market of Bolzano and Trento, so I'm going to look specifically at the labor market and then leave the rest of the economic analysis to Antonio later. So for Bolzano, it's very special. We'll have daily data, so we'll be looking at that. And then also the furlough scheme, so that is the support for the labor market. And then finally, we'll also look at some non-economic measure, which is the NO2 nitrous dioxide emissions. So to start with, on the next slide, we'll see the cases and the mobility. So there are two non-economic measures here. And I would like to highlight two things. So what we see on the top panel is the number of cases per 100,000 people in both provinces. And we see in the colored bar, basically a measure of the restrictions that were adopted or enacted by the Italian national government. And then in the bottom part, we see the mobility and inverse scale. So the higher the curve, the more or the less mobility there was by people. And we see in the first wave that basically is completely following the case count. So the people responded immediately by the rising case count by restricting their own mobility. It took much longer to have this mobility going down towards the summer and the autumn. So cases moved down much more quickly, of course. And then in the second wave that is currently going on, it's literally off the charts here in the number of cases that we see in the two provinces, but the mobility responded much slower and a much delay. So in the first wave, there is a high correlation. In the second wave, it's already very different pattern. So it's a very much evolving situation. I think what is also another thing that we could probably derive from this graph is that in terms of mobility, the two provinces respond quite similarly. In terms of cases, there are some differences, but perhaps these differences are not as stark if you look at them more in a broader region. Anyway, so already we see a big difference between the two waves. On the next slide, we'll move to the economy. And here we have specifically daily employment data for Bolzano that is available to a specific web application that they have published for the pandemic period. So it is set against the mobility data that we also saw on the previous slide. And we see that there is while employment was up by about 2% before the pandemic started relative to the previous year, 2019. This dropped from a +2 to -7.5 around. So we have a drop of 8% in employment. And while mobility recovered gradually towards the summer and over the autumn, we see that employment only recovered much later, really in the summer period from, say, halfway of June onwards. And now again, we are in this second wave period. We see that employment maybe responds a little bit earlier than the mobility. So again, there is this disconnect between what people are doing in terms of their daily business and what we can actually see in employment data. By the way, this is number of contracts, the number of people that have a contract. But it doesn't mean that all these people that have a contract are actually working. It's just a side. So where does this 8% fall and this drop in employment, where does it come from? On the next slide, we see a breakdown by sector from the same data source. And what comes out is that, what already Alessandra was mentioning before, that this fall is completely driven by restaurants and hotels. Right? That's where all these employment were immediately cut or where the contracts were falling. I think in my analysis, when I was looking at this data, this also really indicates that the sectors that have short-term contracts, generally in terms of their labor force, they immediately cut out all those contracts. So they just let them expire and they were not renewed. And there's where we see this big fall. So if you compare restaurants and hotels, and total employment is basically all of this drop in employment is coming from that sector. We see similar behavior as well in the other sectors, such as commerce, transport, and warehousing. In terms of employment numbers, they don't match at all what happened in the restaurants and hotel sectors. Also, other sectors actually respond very differently. If you look at agriculture, you don't see these waves at all. Health and social care, there is also not really this kind of this drop of employment that we see. So some sectors were very resilient, and other sectors not at all. So in the next slide, so this was Bolzano. In the next slide, we'll go to a different indicator, which is hiring, which is taken for the for Trento, which is coming from the labor market analysis office. And I think there are two main takeaways here. And the first one is that hiring dropped earlier than employment, as we saw in the previous slides. So the hiring already dropped by 50% between February and March. And what we also see is that there is a difference in sectors again. So agriculture is the least affected, and public sector is the biggest and the most negative swing. But also public services, interestingly, also is the strongest in hiring again after during the summer period. So these were two indicators of the economy. Let's move on to the next one. The next slide, please. Yeah. This is the furlough scheme. So this is to what extent there was actually government support between the different sectors. And here I would like to indicate two things. One is that the furlough scheme is very much concentrated in different sectors. So again, if we look at manufacturing and restaurants, manufacturing took up most of the furlough scheme in both provinces. And in restaurants and hotels, you don't see it at all. So where contracts were able to be cut, perhaps because the contracts were short-term, you don't see any support in through the furlough scheme. And while contracts maybe are more fixed, such as in manufacturing, you see a huge uptake of that sector. So there seems to be this trade-off between the two different types of contracts and the supported working. Last one, trying to wrap it up very quickly before my 10 minutes is up. Next slide, please. So here we're looking at emissions data. So the emissions are coming from a couple of or a few stations that are scattered throughout the two provinces. And I thought it was an interesting way of looking at what happened to the economy. So again, it is plotted against the mobility index. The emissions are very volatile, so it's harder to see what really happened with the economy, but there's definitely a fall in emissions over the period. When I was looking at how can I calculate what was the emissions fall, you have to take a bench line. So you take 0 as the bench line, you take maybe minus 25 as a benchmark against which to say that would be the normal rate of against which we can look at the emissions. I made two calculations. So if you take the minus 25, I see a fall of emissions of about 5.4% in Bolzano, 4.4% in Trento. If you take 0, it would be 16% in Bolzano, 40% in Trento. And just to say why this might be relevant for the economy, if you go for the next slide, this is taken from the last Bank of Italy report, and they calculate, or they have this prognosis that the fall of GDP in Trento is about 10% or 11%, and in Bolzano it's also about 10%. So these two numbers lie right in the middle of my two estimates here based on emissions. So there seems to be a very close relationship, and then the advantage of emissions, of course, is that I have data from basically in real time. All right, so just to conclude here. So definitely economic consequences, but there's already differences between the first and the second wave, perhaps because of people's behavior has changed over time. Maybe government restrictions are differently implemented over time. You see quite a broad similar patterns in the labor market between Bolzano and Trento. So just to take a step back, real-time local economic analysis, is it possible? Yeah, it is possible for Trento and Bolzano. Some very important measures are observed and are available publicly. I think there's some quick gains in how you harmonize the sectoral breakdowns. They already differ between the two provinces in their reports and also with the national offices. And I think what is very interesting is this Bolzano experience of real-time web app unemployment. I think that should be shared, that experience, and perhaps that might be of use for other regions and provinces to adopt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wessel. Thank you so much. I think we are ready to go to Antonio, who is presenting the business cycle updates from recent report by the Bank of Italy. Antonio, the floor is yours. 15 minutes, please.
Okay, thank you very much. And actually, some of the things I'm going to say in my presentation were already anticipated in the previous one, so I will be quite quick on those parts. If we could, should I start my presentation or? Okay, great. Actually, as Alexandra said, there is a tradition, and now we are respecting the tradition this year. And I'm presenting actually the business cycle update that was published almost 1 month ago. Actually, this document is is an update of the information that we generally present in a larger report that is actually published in June. So the structure of the document is this one. The document is in Italian, so the table of content is in Italian. It is basically made of 4 chapters. There is an initial chapter that actually summarizes the main findings of the document. Then there is one chapter related to the firms. All the sectoral developments at firm level, and we also focus on the economic and financial conditions of firms. Then there is a 3rd chapter on the labor market and the households, and then there is a final chapter that is fully dedicated on the credit market. Actually, I'm not obviously the only author of this document, and you can find the authors of the document at the bottom of this slide. Next slide, please. Basically, this is the overall picture. Actually, it was already mentioned before. The pandemic is hitting very hard the economy of Italy and also the economies of Trentino and Alto-Adige. And basically, these are the forecasts of GDP growth for this year. And I mean, both for Trentino and for Alto-Adige, the drop in GDP is around or even slightly larger than 10%. This is even slightly larger than the one that is forecasted for Italy as a whole, that is minus 0.5%, according to the estimates of the Bank of Italy. Actually, in the first part of the year, we can actually find 2 distinct business cycle moments. In the first part, there was a very large drop in all economic activities that was followed by a slight recovery in the summer. However, I mean the entire economic environment is characterized by very high uncertainty, and this is leading to a sharp decrease in investments by firms and in consumption, in particular in consumption of durable goods by households. Let me focus on the last bullet point of this slide. That is actually related on the liquidity conditions of firms. Actually, the lockdown in the first part of the year generated a very strong increase in liquidity demand by firms. Actually, this liquidity demand was met by the banking sector, and in particular, there are two main programs that helped a lot the firms to meet these liquidity requirements, that are the so-called moratoria, the suspensions in the payments of existing loans. And then there is the new credit that is actually related to the public guarantee schemes that were actually created both at national and at provincial level, both in Trentino and in Alto-Adige. Next slide. Actually, here in this slide, you can find some figures related to the drop in the first semester. Actually, here there are a number of figures that come from several sources: the Chamber of Commerce, the Italian Statistical Office, and so forth. Let me just mention a few of these numbers. For example, in Trentino, the manufacturing sales it decreased by more than 17%. The tourist arrivals were actually lower by more than 40% with respect to the same period of the year before. As you can see, basically in the first part of the year, there was actually an unprecedented drop in economic activity that was never experienced by an advanced economy in a peace period. This is something that should be strongly taken in mind if we consider, I mean, all the future developments for the rest of the year and for the next year. In the next slide, instead, I present some figures related to the so-called summer recovery. This summer recovery was actually partial. I mean, it only helped to reduce a little bit the drops that were registered in the first part of the year. And in particular, this summer recovery was mainly concentrated in the manufacturing sector and in the construction. And this is also can also be seen, for example, for the construction sector. Here there are the hours worked in July, August with respect to the same period of 2019. And as you can see, there was a slight increase in summer due to actually, I mean, there was a summer recovery of past work that were actually left behind during the lockdown period. And even our survey on the industrial firms actually show that during the summer period, there was a stabilization and even a slight increase in sales. And I mean, at least when we surveyed these firms, that was early October, firms were quite optimistic in the ability to have a further improvement for the spring of the next year. In the figure instead, you can see a change in overnight stays for the tourist sector. And as you can see, I mean, the first part of the year, January, February, there was an increase, even a quite relevant increase in overnight stays. Then there was actually a drop in the month from March to actually June. There were no tourists in Trentino and in Alto-Adige, and even the recovery during the summer period was only partial. Actually, still, if we compare the month of August, for example, of 2020, and the same month of 1 year before, actually there were still less overnight stays in Trentino with respect to the same period of the year before. And the difference here is made by foreign tourists. Actually, there were much less foreign tourists with respect to the last year. Next. Actually, this drop, and in particular the lockdown of the first part of the year, generated a very sharp decrease in the profitability of firms. Here you can find actually the data by the chambers of commerce of Trento and Bolzano on the opinions on business profitability by the surveyed firm. And as you can see, there was a very, very large decrease. We have to say that profitability was at a very high level before the COVID-19. And even when we look at the drop, I mean, the drop is dramatic, but still 50% of firms, for example, in Alto-Adige, and more than 60% of firms in Trentino are quite satisfied by their profitability. That I mean, it's quite a high number if we compare with the big drop in GDP that we have seen before. This drop in in the profitability had, as I said before, a very huge consequences, and this can be in the next slide, on the credit demand by firms. In this slide, you can see the results of a Bank of Italy survey on the main banks that operate in Trentino and in Alto-Adige. And in particular, this slide shows the trends in credit demand by firms. As you can see, in the first half of 2020, there was a huge increase in the demand of credit. Actually, the increase was much larger in Trentino than in Alto-Adige. And this increase was actually driven by the need to finance the working capital and the debt restructuring. As you can see, the green part, the gray part that is investment actually has disappeared, and even in the province of Bolzano actually contributed in a negative way to the trend of credit demand. And in the next slide, we can see that this credit demand was actually met by the banking system. And as you can see, I mean, you can just look at the black line in this graph. This is the annual percentage change in loans to firms. And as you can see, starting from March 2020, there was a sharp acceleration in firm loans. Actually, in this graph, I mean, this graph stops in June, but we also have an update in September, and it is actually the same. It is still growing. It's growing at a very high pace. And as you can see, I mean, the growth is actually driven by large firms, but also small firms in Trentino that were characterized in the past by a very, very sharp decrease in loans are actually recovering up and are receiving loans by the credit system. And this increase in loans is actually driven by by both the moratoria that actually has stopped the repayments of existing loans, but also is strongly driven by the public guarantee schemes that actually increased a lot the availability of new credit to firms. And this is also confirmed for the province of Bolzano. Just a few words in the next slide on the labor market. Actually, tomorrow these figures will be old, since we will have the third quarter in the employment. Actually, this is not something that is really new. I mean, the employment in the first part of the year has decreased, but it did not decrease much compared with the drop in GDP. And the reason why employment did not decrease too much is that actually the firings were stopped by law, and at the same time, as even in the previous presentation was shown, actually there were new new measures that is actually this Cassa Integrazione COVID, the COVID that was made available for firms. And in this way, basically, firms were not, I mean, could not fire, but at the same time, the payroll of the workers was actually transferred to the public system through this Cassa Integrazione. Actually, we also have more timely data that is actually that are based on the flows of employees' jobs. And here in this graph, you can see something that is that has stopped in August. Actually, for the province of Bolzano, we have daily data up up until last week, basically. But let me just say that the trends in this graph is confirmed even if we arrive to the most recent date, and in particular you can see a very huge drop in the number of jobs of employee jobs in the first part of the year. Then there was a partial recovery, but as I said before, this recovery was really partial, so it was not able to fully recover the drop of the first year. If we stop in August, actually in Trentino there are something less 4,000 jobs less than last year, while in Alto-Adige the drop is larger, and it is it can be actually created measured in 10,000 jobs less compared to the last year. This uncertainty related to the economic conditions and the labor market in particular had an impact on the consumptions by households, and this can also be seen in the next slide by the credit to households. In particular, if you look at this slide, and I mean here there are the loans to households, and as you can see, basically there was a relevant acceleration in the first part of 2020 for the total amount of loans, that is the green line, and this deceleration was actually driven by the very large stop in consumer loans. So basically these are loans that are aimed at financing durable consumption, like buying a car, buying I don't know, a kitchen or something like that. And actually, this type of consumption actually halted in the first part of the year. I think we can skip the next slide. Okay, we can skip it because actually it is a summary for the credit market for both loans and firms. And let me just say a few words on the credit quality. The credit quality is stable, and it is even improving a little bit. The consequence for this is that, I mean, there were a lot of public measures actually aimed at preserving businesses, in preserving jobs. And there were also a lot of recommendations by the supervisory authorities on the fact that, I mean, in this phase, the classification of loans to non-performing could actually be, I mean, a little bit, I mean, it could be treated with much more caution than the past. So actually, we still don't see any effect of such a big crisis on credit quality. This doesn't mean that we will not be able to see it in the future, but this actually implies that these public measures are actually postponing the impact of this crisis on the bank balances in the future. And even the stock of non-performing loans is still decreasing, and this is actually good news, because we were still actually trying to face the consequences of previous crisis on the stock of non-performing loans, in particularly in Trentino. My last slide is instead on the financial savings. Actually, here you can see that the financial savings are increasing for both households and firms. And the reason is that the precautionary savings by both households and firms is increasing a lot due to uncertainty. I mean, this is something that is related to the fact that still we don't know how long will be the crisis, and even firms are actually trying to accumulate as much as liquidity on their bank accounts in order to face the uncertainty of the future. And this is true for both Trentino and Alto-Adige. I think I finished, and I thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Antonio. Quite insightful and detailed presentation. So in the next presentation, I would like to show pretty brief analysis of the online job postings from Burning Glass data. May I have the next slide, please? So we are looking at the data set for Italy, which includes quite a bit of job vacancies, individual postings, and we have different indicators for each posting, which include industry and occupational classification, required skills, location, and a few other characteristics. As any data source, it has advantages and limitations. I think I have to highlight here that, first of all, among advantages, we can list the size of the data set. It was made available for Europe only this year. It's very fresh, so I'm very happy to report first results, but also I would like to ask you to keep them or take them with a grain of salt, because this data was not actually verified rigorously against the official data sources. But still, we have about 100,000 monthly postings in the data set for Italy. Most importantly, we do have exact phrasings that employers are using in their advertisements. So we know exactly what employers are looking for. This information usually is not available in official data sources. Limitations, as I said, first of all, it's not checked yet, but I hope it is representative and well informative, given the experience of the Burning Glass with other countries. We do have missing data for some of the variables, such as, for example, pay or full-time versus part-time positions. And then representativeness does depend on the willingness or propensity of employers to advertise online. And we also know that over time, algorithms change, and this results in changes in the quality of data over time. But we are looking at the last few months, so it shouldn't affect our analysis. Next slide, please. So we are looking at the total number of job postings, and here it is presented as an index where January is taken as 100%. We are looking at Italy, which is a solid line, and then for the two provinces, Trento is a dashed line and Bolzano is a dotted line. The numbers are for Italy. From this chart, I would like you to take two things. First one is that we definitely see two periods. First, of pretty sharp contraction, and then partial recovery, which is already highlighted in previous presentations. If we look at the specific industries or specific, provinces, we see that Trento tends to follow very closely the national pattern and outperforming generally a little bit. Bolzano is underperforming and recovery is slower, but otherwise the trends are very similar for the provinces and a nation. Next slide, please. In the next slide, we'll be looking more detailed. We'll be looking at manufacturing, which is a solid line, and services, which is a dotted line for Italy, Bolzano, and Trento. In Italy, nationally, we see a very sharp decline, which we saw already, and the trajectories for manufacturing and services are very closely related. It is not the case in the recovery phase, when manufacturing in Italy did on average better than services, which were lagging behind. If we go into regions, we see that for Trento, services do follow pretty closely the national averages in terms of decrease and recovery. Manufacturing did a little bit better, but not too much. It is slightly different in Bolzano, where services performed worse compared to both Trento and nation, but manufacturing did quite well in terms of hirings. Next slide, please. And in the next slide, we go into even more details. Now we are not looking at an index, we are looking at total number of job postings for Italy and for the 2 provinces by industry. In the Italian chart, what I want you to see is that, first of all, we have our kind of all industries ordered, and this order usually doesn't flip during the recession. It's like we have a little ribbon kind of tying up the lines in April where the largest decreases, and then we have rebalancing. The order of the positions doesn't change except for 2 industries. One is healthcare. Naturally, we had an increase between February and March. And then we have very sharp, but still not as big recovery for accommodation and food. For provinces, Trento follows pretty closely the pattern of Italy. We see increase in healthcare and accommodation and food, like we saw nationally. We also see increase for public administration and compounded orange line in Trento. Bolzano is different, and we will see throughout the presentation that Bolzano, in terms of job postings online, performs differently. Probably the main highlight is that manufacturing did pretty strongly, and it kept quite a high level of hirings through the recession. Next slide, please. In the next slide, we now look separately at 2 time periods. We have contraction, which is January to April, and then we'll look January to July, so we can compare the recovery kind of phase, whether recovery was above or below the level observed in the beginning of the year. And we're here also looking at percentage growth. So if we look at the contraction phase, nationally, the best performing industry was human health and social work activities, which is expected. The most affected sector was accommodation and food, and it was not the case for provinces. We see again manufacturing performing really well in Bolzano, but arts, entertainment, and recreation being the most affected sector. In Trentino, all industries are in the negative zone, except for financial and insurance activities, which saw about 40% increase in number of job postings between January and April. In the recovery phase, we see that several industries managed to go above January level in terms of job postings. For Italy, it was real estate activities, but also in the next slide, we'll see that it is accommodation and food. Education was a strongly growing sector in terms of job postings and Bolzano. Construction kept their hirings, at least advertised online, relatively low. And for Trento, we have transportation and storage still lagging behind, but electricity and gas kind of growing the most. I also have to say there that we excluded from these charts the industries which started with less than 10 job postings in January. In the next slide, we'll show a little bit more detail, but it is basically the previous chart. We'll look at the 2 periods, which are displayed one above another. It is again percent growth, and it is shown for all industries, major industries for Italy, which is dark bar, a dark blue bar, for Bolzano, gray bar, and light blue for Trentino. A few things to take out of this. When we look at the top bar, which corresponds to the contraction phase, we see that pretty much everything went down. The only plausible exception is financial and insurance activities in Trentino, which grew up by 40% and which started with a quite large number of job postings, so at least above 10 in January. Electricity and gas in Bolzano, which went up actually by 100%. It was increased from 8 to 16 job postings, so it's probably the artifact of small numbers. In general, Bolzano shows very strong performance in manufacturing, but also in few other industries where it outperforms Trentino and Italy. Notably in accommodation and food, contraction was smaller, information and communications technology, real estate, and few others. In the recovery phase, we see that pretty much most of the industries for Italy and in region decreased the gap, but we still see quite a few contracting, so recovery wasn't as big. Several industries managed to go above in terms of job postings, their January level. And for those that go above, it is predominantly in Trentino. So Trentino performed better in the recovery phase. Again, tourism kind of rebounds, if we can call it rebounding, because January and summer, there are seasonal variations, which are also kind of factoring in these numbers. And in my last slide, I would like to show a few graphs, actually 2 graphs. We wanted to look at the demand for new technological skills and whether it exists in the 2 provinces. So we looked at artificial intelligence, which we recorded as one if individual job posting had as the keyword either artificial intelligence or machine learning or Internet of Things. And we looked at robotics. So what we take from these 2 charts, one of them shows the total number of job postings for artificial intelligence, robotics, and total in the last year and this year. And then we have as a share of total job postings nationally or in the region. First of all, and I think it's very reassuring that there is demand for jobs which list artificial intelligence as a required skill. So I think the 2 provinces have something to build on. The numbers are extremely low, of course. Trentino did really well, despite the crisis. The total number of announcements that require AI skills went up. And Trentino also does better than national average in terms of share of total job postings that refer either to AI or to robotics. And actually, in terms of robotics, Trentino appears relatively strong. So I think it's a little kind of positive twist to the all these negative numbers that we saw in the previous slides. And I hope that the 2 provinces will be able to build on this expertise that nascent right now, but it exists. And going in the future, it might be the basis of stronger and more resilient economy. So thank you so much. I think I will stop here. We have our last presentation now, moving away from economic dimension into social dimension and social economy. And I would like to give the floor to Chiara Carini, who will be talking about cooperatives, their size, impact, and recent trends in the 2 provinces. Excuse me. Chiara, the floor is yours. You have 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for this opportunity to share some data and reflection about the cooperative sector in the province of Trento and Bolzano. Could you please share my slides? Thank you. So unfortunately, unlike the previous presentations, we still have few data about 2020. And so basically what I'm going to do with my presentation is to propose you some results of recent research we conducted as a RICSE in order to reflect on the possible consequences that the pandemic might have on the cooperative sector, both in Trento and Bolzano. Next slide, please. Okay, so the starting point of my presentation is an overview of the cooperatives in the 2 provinces. Probably many of you knows that cooperatives are a relevant component of the economy in the 2 provinces. On this slide, you can find the trend of the number of cooperatives in Bolzano and Trento and the trend of the number of employees of such organizations in the 2 provinces, covering the period from 1996 until 2018. 2018 is the last year for which we have official data, so it's the most up-to-date data we have. The blue line represents Bolzano and the green line represents Trento. And as you can see, there are differences in the two graphs you can see. In the first one, so in the graph referring to the number of cooperatives, you can see that there is a larger number of cooperatives in the province of Bolzano comparing to the number of cooperatives in Trento. But on the other side, looking at the number of employees, you can see that the number of employees is larger in Trentino. Employees in cooperatives is larger in Trentino than the number of employees in Bolzano. We have more or less 500 cooperatives in Trento and 700 cooperatives in Bolzano, and we have 11,000 employees in Bolzano and the double, so 22,000 employees in Trento. If you compare these numbers, so the number of organizations and the number of employees to the numbers of the total private companies in the two provinces, you will see that the weight of the cooperatives on the total number of private companies in the two provinces is quite similar. Cooperatives represent 1.2% of private companies in the province of Trento and 1.6% in the province of Bolzano, but there is a huge difference in the percentages related to the employees. Indeed, employment in cooperatives in the province of Trento represent more than 12% of private employment in the province of Trentino, while on the other side, employment in Bolzano cooperatives represent only the 5% of the total employment in private companies. This is just to say that we are talking about cooperatives, but the cooperative sectors in the two provinces are quite different. So there are different in terms of trend over the last 20 years. There are difference in terms of size of organizations. In the Trentino province, we have bigger cooperatives than in the Bolzano province. And then if we could have a look at the distribution across sector, we would see that there are differences also in the sectorial distribution of cooperatives. And this is important because these differences might be reflected also in the different impact and consequences that the pandemic can have and will have on cooperatives during this year and the next years. Next slide, please. So as I was saying, we still have a few data about these years. So we still have fragmented data about cooperatives, turnover, economic performances, and employment in Trentino and South Tyrol for this year. And so we are not able at the moment to perform an analysis of the economic and employment impact of the pandemic over these organizations. What we can do is to look at the performances of cooperatives during the recent economic crisis. So during the last recent economic crisis, the crisis we had between 2008 and 2017, to have some insight of the reaction of cooperatives in the period of crisis. And if we look at the studies we computed about this period, we see that cooperatives in the two provinces, but in general at national level, cooperatives had an anti-cyclical function. So during the crisis, cooperatives did not show economic problems, did not show a drop in the employment levels. So they performed differently from other types of companies. This does not mean that cooperatives did not have problems during the crisis. It means that they internalized the problems and they found solution inside the organization to manage such type of problems. Of course, the crisis we are facing is different. It's not just an economic crisis. It's an health crisis. And so it's necessary to reflect on which can be the consequences of this pandemic, and if we can think about it is plausible to think that cooperatives will react in the same way they reacted during the last crisis. Next slide, please. So some preliminary consideration can be deducted from the data we received from the local Chamber of Commerce, and these data are related to new registration and cancellations of cooperatives during the last six years. I should mention that the data for the 2020 covers only the first 3 quarters of the year. So we still do not have data about the last quarter of the year. But as you can see, there is a drop in the number of cancellations and new registrations, both in the number of cancellations and new registration for 2020. For cancellations, I think we should wait until the end of the year to evaluate the total number of cancellations, because due to administrative rules, probably the number will increase during the last quarter of the year. But the data that is quite interesting is the data about new registration. There is a huge drop in the number of the new registrations of cooperatives, and probably this means that the pandemic stopped the entrepreneurial initiatives, so stopped the decision to establish new cooperatives in the 2 provinces. Next slide, please. Okay, so other consideration can be derived looking at the results of a survey that has been conducted by the local Federation of Cooperatives in Trentino, and by comparing these results with the results of researches we conducted during the last recent years. Basically, the local Federation of Trentino asked their member on the problems that they managed during the pandemic. And the main concerns were related to the turnover and the employment. Basically, half of the cooperatives declared a decrease in turnover during the first months of the pandemic, so during spring and summer. And the sectors that were suffering the most were the social sectors, worker and service cooperatives. On the other side, consumer cooperatives, which means supermarkets, registered an increase in turnover. And then on the employment side, there is a huge concern on the employment levels. So talking about turnover, next slide, please. So talking about turnover, we said that based on the survey of the local federation, the most affected sectors were the social services sector, and then worker and user cooperatives. And this is quite interesting, because if you look at the sectorial distribution of the value added produced by cooperatives, and here we have data for 2015, and we compare and we have changes for the previous economic crisis, so data for the 2008 and 2015 period. So if you look at the data of this sectorial distribution of the value added of cooperatives for these periods, and you compare the data for the province of Trento and the province of Bolzano, you will see that the cooperatives in the province of Bolzano produce value added mainly in the sector of the agriculture and in the user sector, specifically in the electricity sector, so utilities sector, which are not so affected by the crisis, according to the local survey. On the other side, cooperatives in Trentino are more distributed across all the sectors, and you can find a lot of cooperatives in the social sector. Social cooperatives in Trentino is a huge part of the cooperative sector. So what I'm saying is that we can probably suppose that the economic impact of the pandemic will be more relevant in the province of Trento than in the province of Bolzano for cooperative speaking. Next slide. As for the employment, I would like just to say a few words. During the last crisis, so during the period between 2008 and 2015, cooperatives, both in the province of Trento and in the province of Bolzano, registered a huge increase in the number of employees, and their trend was very different from the trend of corporations. So the key point here is to look how cooperatives will react in coming years, and to analyze whether cooperatives will react in the same way they reacted during the last crisis, or whether the reaction will be different. We should mention that in the cooperative world, in the cooperative sector, there is a large number of workers who are fixed-term workers. So due to the type of activity which is carried out by these companies, these organizations, and there is a large number of part-time workers. So reflecting on the impact of this crisis of the pandemic over this type of employees will be very important in coming months and coming years. Next slide, please. And just to come to conclusion, the data I presented in the last slides proposed some reflection on the direct impact that the pandemic might have on the action of cooperatives, but we should think also about the indirect consequences that the pandemic might have over the action of cooperatives. On this slide, you can find some data specific for the social sector in Trentino province. As Eric said, we carry out an impact research on social cooperatives, and according to this research, in the year 2017, about 19,000 persons received services from the type A social cooperatives, so health and social care services, and more than 1,000 persons were employed by type B social cooperatives. So the key point here is that in coming months, we will be requested to reflect on the impact that the pandemic will have on the life of these people. So if the pandemics had consequences on the activity of social cooperatives, probably also the life of this person will be affected too. And on the other side, we should reflect, we should work also on the analysis of the income of people and consequences of the income of people that are employed by cooperatives, and in this case by social cooperatives. Just to give you an idea, 70% of the turnover of social cooperatives is used to cover cost of personnel. So 70% of the turnover is distributed to people. And another, and I come to conclusion, another important data refer to the local economy. Always according to the impact research, 80% of the purchases made by social cooperatives are made in the Trentino provinces. So an impact on the activity of the cooperatives imply also an impact, an indirect impact on the activity of other economic realities. And you should consider that also 80% of these purchases are made in favor of third sector entities. And so we should reflect also on the impact that the pandemic might have over the social world and the third sector world. Next slide, please. Just to come to conclusion, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, we still have a few data about real data about 2020. And as Ulrich said, we are actually working on this. We are working on local report about the impact and consequences of the pandemic over cooperative sectors. And I hope that I will be able to join the next year seminar, hopefully, and share with you the results of this work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chiara. We do hope that our next December meeting will be in person and we can really take stock and reflect back on how we went through this very special time of the year, or time of our life. And we definitely hope that that's the event that happens once in a century and it stays this way. Now we are at the end of our presentations. I do not see any questions in the Q&A session. I would suggest that if somebody in the audience has any questions, please use my email address, which is on the agenda, and just send it to me and I will forward to appropriate speakers if it is a speaker directed question, and we will continue our conversation. But now I would like to invite Andrea Fracassa to offer concluding remarks, and this would allow us to stay on time. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to offer some closing remarks. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to consider and read these presentations beforehand. So I think that they raise a number of very interesting issues and complementary piece of evidence on the current situation and on the impact of COVID and the lifting of the measures afterwards in the regions and more in general. I think that what we bring home is that certainly the impact of COVID and of the lockdown measures was very diversified across sectors, across firms, across workers, banks, regions in general. And so, I mean, I want to keep this in mind, this idea of heterogeneity, because large heterogeneity together with high volatility are the causes of what we know is uncertainty, and has been said several times, particularly in Antonio's presentation, that uncertainty affected negatively the business activity and also the consumers and the households activity. We have seen that in the loans, in the investment plans, in the savings. So notwithstanding the efforts that the authorities at the international, national, and local level have spent so far, still we see that people, companies are concerned about the future, and rightly so for the intrinsic and the special nature of such a shock. And so I would like to come back on this in a second, but so the second consequence of this large heterogeneity is the reflection that this has on the regional differences that we have seen. So for people that are familiar with the Trentino and Alto-Adige regions, we know that they are different despite being so similar to a certain extent. And so all the results that have been presented this evening, they support and strengthen our knowledge to a certain extent that these two regions differ both in structural aspects and in cyclical aspects. And I think that this is important. For instance, the distance in the performance of the regional banks in the two regions is the only slide that Antonio didn't show, unfortunately, is impressive because regional banks in Alto-Adige lent a lot during the last years and also during the COVID period, while in Trentino, this is not there, while the non-regional banks behave more or less the same in both regions. Also, the job posting that Alessandra has shown, for instance, in the construction and the transport sector in the two regions are very, very different. And the reason why I'm picking on this is that also Chiara mentioned a number of differences across cooperatives, their composition, their role, their activities. So if you put together differences in the cooperative sector, differences in the banking sector, and also the heterogeneity that I discussed, I think that perhaps a possible venue for research and also for policy debate here is to what extent these regional differences may affect also the process of recovery. So what are going to be the actors that can lead the recovery, and how the public sector activities interact with the specificities of these two regions. Then, if I may, I would like also to make a more technical, if you like, remarks. And I think that all presentations, and I concur, stress the idea that we should use more real-time indicators and high-frequency indicators. I totally share this view. Everything has speed up in time, so also policy making requires data that are fresh and easily available. That said, I think we should also develop, to a certain extent, a new way of interpreting such real-time data, because of course there is a lot of noise. We don't have the time to check them, several times as usually done. And also we have to interpret them all together at the same time. And there is no easy way, there's no dashboard that can do that. No? So for instance, let me give you an example. In the presentation by Wessel, there is the employment in Bolzano. And Wessel described pretty well the drop in March. What struck me from the presentation was that there is another drop in Bolzano in September, October. And the only two sectors that are dropping in that period are agriculture and restaurants. How come? So are they so important? Of course, the answer is yes. But the agricultural sector is basically, the drop in agricultural sector is identical to the overall drop in the province. But to a certain extent, this is obvious if one keeps in mind everything that's been said about the furlough schemes, the cassa integrazione, the prohibition to dismiss the workers in the manufacturing sector, for instance. So we know that very many workers were protected, and those that were at the margin in non-standards, in seasonal contracts, were more exposed. So in a sense, I think that the dashboard of real-time data is not enough. It could be even dangerous to a certain extent. Another example, very quickly, is this idea that the companies in Trentino are increasing their savings in the banking sector, but at the same time, they are borrowing more for working capital for activities that are frozen. It's another interesting set of results that could be explored. So I want to close here by simply, let me say, getting back to the words that Alessandra Protos has said, the remarks at the very beginning. So and also Chiara in the end, this importance of understanding heterogeneity for its implication on rising inequality. And I think that perhaps this effort in developing real-time index and real-time indicators should also go in that direction. Real-time indicators of disparities, the real-time indicators of inequality. And I think that this is important for all the reasons that our panelists have already explained. I would add to that, perhaps, that there is a risk of a self-enforcing economic polarization in the society, to which psychological problems, because there will be psychological problems on a number of people exposed to the pandemics and the economic consequences, would add. And also what Alexandra mentioned at the very end, the introduction of remote working, digital technologies, important changes in the way the economy will work in the future. So in a nutshell, I think that all this heterogeneity and these big changes will affect people, and in this way they will affect also territories. And the risk is that we might have also growing political tensions, not in Trentino and in Alto-Adige, but in general, I mean, across regions that differ so much, so that economic geography disparities will turn into political tensions and social tensions that clearly we don't want to see in any country, and in particular in ours, given that in this case we are living here at the moment. But I think the implication is more general and applies to all countries. Thank you very much for patiently listening to me.
Thank you, Andrea. I think you really highlighted the big picture, kind of. We took it from big picture, what is going on, and then we took it through the lens of our host region, and we brought it back to actually what it means for our lives and going into the future. So I think it really gives a really rounded kind of perspective, and gives a lot of food for thought for all of us to see how we can really minimize these disparities that were already on the rise, and they are likely to be exacerbated by the crisis. And quite a prudent approach to the data. Of course, we need to be very careful and understand what it means and how it is collected and how it informs and what it can tell us and what it cannot. So thank you so much. I think this will conclude our meeting. We will continue our conversation in the next year. I really hope, as I said, that our last meeting of the next year will be in person, so we can maybe spend a little bit longer in this reality of webinars. We usually try to keep it shorter just because it's just everybody's tired of webinars. It would be really nice to be back in the room all together. I thank very much our audience, people who are listening to us. I hope you will be joining us in the future. Right now, we are planning the next SPL meeting at the end of January, and we plan to go back to our roots and talk more about productivity and how the discourse about productivity actually changed over this current or the next year. So in 2020, how the pandemics changed our discourse and our perception of productivity and all different facets that are related to it. So on this note, I would like to thank you and wish you all happy holidays, which are coming in just 2 weeks. This year is finally over, almost. I wish you the next year much happier, much more predictable than this one. Thank you so much.